guys, I'm Amanda, the Botanical Brunette, and welcome to my channel. So some of you may or may not know that a couple weeks ago, I launched a propagation station collection in my Etsy shop. And I also wrote a blog on this as well. So this will be kind of like more of a visual version of my blog. So I'm going to tell you guys all about water propagation. This is going to be a 101 water propagation. We're going back to the basics kind of video. Water propagation is one of my favorite ways to propagate. It is my OG propagation method. I have almost never had an issue with water propagation. From time to time, I do get root rot, but I will give you guys some tips on how to avoid that, and also how to successfully propagate your plants, and basically how I have had some great success with water propagation. So for today's video, I have a plant that desperately needs to be propagated. This is my Pothos in this really cool like skull planter. You guys probably have seen this several times in some of my plant tours, plant hauls, all those things. This is always kind of in the background on my shelf. I love this plant so much, but it is so long to the point where it's hitting my floor. So it's time to propagate. It's time to kind of give it a little bit of a haircut, and also maybe to like fill out the pot a little bit. And that's a good thing about like propagating your plants, is not only can you create more plants, you can also fill out a pot. If you get a small or kind of a bare potted plant, you can always propagate that plant, and once that starts growing roots, you can always just plant it and fill out that pot and you have a fuller plant. So I'm gonna go over step by step on how I propagate and basically like how to get started. Before we get into that, please like this video at the end of the video if you like this kind of content. And also, if you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing, helps my channel out a ton. And without further ado, let's get started. Let's propagate this Pothos. Before you go into cutting up all your plants, there's a few things that you'll want to do before you get started. For instance, your vessel or your container. I typically like to go for containers that are reusable. So this was, I don't actually know what this was, but as you can see, it had a cap on it. So I think it was like a jar for something, I don't remember, but I thought it was cool, so I was like, propagation station. And this old Coke bottle was a great propagation station for one of my Pothos. It was in there for such a long time. I had to throw it out because it got spider mites, but yeah, so you can reuse any propagation stations. I know that I think it's called Oui by Yoplait, the French yogurt, so good. It's in a glass jar, it's a little expensive, but it's in a glass jar, and I've actually planted plants in that. I love the idea to repurpose things, but also a lot of my propagation jars come from the dollar store. So you can kind of play around with water propagation when you have your vessel. I also have these, so this is one of my like hanging planters. This is Lucia, so this one hangs on your wall. You can hang it on your wall just as long as any of your stations are in a bright area. You'll be able to have a successful propagation. And when I say a bright area, you don't need to have it in like sunlight, but make sure that you have it in an area that gets a good amount of bright indirect light. So when you're starting out with your vessel, because I do like to reuse my jars and everything like that, I make sure I thoroughly clean and sanitize them. So for like the Coke bottle, for instance.
Minutes, starting now. By the way, if you want to change your timer, try asking me. Change timer to 5 minutes.
I don't know where that came from. So for instance, this Coke bottle, I made sure there was obviously no Coke in it. I rinsed it out with hot soapy water. I believe I used dish detergent, and I made sure that it was sanitized. What I do to sanitize them is I put a little bit of diluted bleach in with hot water, and I let it sit for about 10 minutes. After that, I wash it out with hot soapy water again, just to make sure that there's nothing in there that's going to harm the cuttings or anything like that. If it's a brand new jar that you just got at the store, I still would go in and kind of just wash it out with some warm soapy water. You don't have to go in with the sanitizing with the bleach unless you want to be super careful, but I wouldn't, you know, it's not really super necessary if it's a brand new jar, but also definitely do the sanitizing if you are reusing, even from another propagation. You don't want any of that like bacteria that's built up from the other propagations or really anything. You kind of just really want to start fresh. You want to start completely clean, sanitized, ready to go. And you'll also want to do that each time you change out the water. You don't have to go as aggressively as bleaching it. After about a week, I make sure that I go around and I replace the water in all my propagation stations. It kind of depends on how dirty the water is. For instance, like this one, like the water, I don't know if the camera's gonna catch it, but you can kind of start to see like there's like a little bit of like clouding that comes in the top, and it just kind of gets grimy at the bottom. I get a lot of like sediment at the bottom of my propagation stations. If I have that, I make sure that I sanitize that again. If I have a lot of sediment, or if I have a lot of like, sometimes the propagation stations can get a little gross around the sides. You kind of know what I mean by gross. But what you want to do is just kind of rinse them out, wipe them down, really wash them good, make sure that they're nice and clean and ready for another propagation, or to put your old propagation back in to keep going. Once you have your vessel or your container or whatever you want to call it, once you have that all cleaned and sanitized, you are now ready to grab your cutting. But before you grab scissors and cut your cutting, you need to make sure that your scissors are sanitized. So I just have these regular old scissors. Don't judge me on how they look. They are not dirty, they're burned. I didn't realize that there was still stuff on it. I didn't like wash it. So that just kind of burned on there. So yeah, what you'll want to do is just take like a paper towel or anything like that, and you'll want to wipe down your scissors, your shears, whatever you're going to use to cut with rubbing alcohol. So I'm going to do that now. So be careful with your scissors. I just take like a little dab of rubbing alcohol, and then you're just going to want to like just wipe your shears off, and make sure that any of your instruments that you're going to use to cut your plants with are sharp. You'll want a nice, clean, sharp cut when you're doing your cuttings. So you'll want to make sure that there's not a lot of like, you don't want to like hack at your plant. Also, that's also kind of traumatizing, I feel like. So when you find a plant that you want to take a cutting from, you'll want to make sure that you find what we call nodes. Now I know for some of you veterans this might be really redundant and you can skip this part if you'd like, but for people who are just starting out, I wanted to show you guys what nodes look like. So these are nodes. These little bumps that you'll see on stems are nodes. So any of those are going to be roots one day. So you'll want to make sure that when you take a cutting for your plant that you'll want to take it at least an inch below the node. You'll want to make sure that you have enough stem that will be able to be submerged in the water. You want those nodes to be submerged in the water because, like I said, those are going to eventually become roots. And you'll also want to make sure that you'll have enough room that you won't have to cut a leaf off when you eventually want to plant it. So make sure that you find really good nodes. So I'm probably for this stem, I'm going to probably cut, it's so hard to see. I'm going to probably cut about here, and I'm going to cut probably around here. I'm just going to cut a few cuttings for this. I actually already have a pre-filled jar. Any of my jars I fill with room temperature. Filtered water is preferable. You can use tap water, depending on where you live. If you live in a place that has a lot of chlorine and a lot of like chemicals in your tap water, maybe just leave it out overnight or like 24 hours just to kind of let that evaporate. But I've been fine with my tap water here in Florida. So if you're in Florida, it's probably okay. But I do filtered room temperature just because, you know, I don't want any of that. I do have a lot of chlorine in my water, I found, and it is a little bit harder. So I don't want any of that to mess with my cuttings. Let's start cutting. So I have my vessel. Like I said, I'm gonna put that aside. And then I'm gonna grab some of those good nodes. This has really, look at those nodes. Those are so good. So I'm gonna take a few cuttings of this plant, like I said. So it's up to you. I have found that it is easier to take multiple cuttings, so keep cutting down the strip. You can also try to take a trailing piece and just propagate just like this piece. Sometimes it's hard on the plant and it doesn't grow roots and it will rot. I've just found in my experience that it's just a lot easier to just kind of chop up little pieces. If you have a leaf that's starting to unfurl like this, try to take the leaf that is just below it or a couple below it. That way it still has a little bit of energy to kind of photosynthesize and grow a little bit. So for one, I'm going to take a long trailing piece, and the other one I'm going to take several pieces, so you guys can kind of see what I do there. So let's take this. So I'm gonna cut, so we have a node here and a node here, and I'm gonna cut right below this leaf, and we're just gonna chop it. So now you have that. And then I'm just gonna keep kind of cutting down the line. Just keep cutting those little pieces. So cut. And eventually you'll get new leaves emerging from the stems. And let me gather these all together. So now I have stems with a ton of nodes. So those are gonna grow some really great roots. And this is the easy part, guys. So you have the option. I wanna just make this clear. You have the option to let these sit out for 48 to 72 hours. Or you can just plop them in water. The only reason why I would suggest to let them callus is you don't run the risk of root rot. Sometimes if you just kind of put them in water, the wound is still kind of fresh and it could start rotting. If you do put it in water immediately, just keep an eye on it and make sure that the stem isn't like turning black at all, and make sure that, you know, the roots are doing okay. For pothos, I really haven't had an issue with that, but for other plants I have, like philodendrons, I've had problems with that. For now, just for these educational purposes, I will just be putting them right in water. To callus a plant over, you just put them on a paper towel and let them sit out for, like I said, about 48 to 72 hours. And once it's calloused over, or, you know, at least you can, it's a little bit drier on the ends, you can plant those right in. So these are my several cuttings. So I got that all in there. And then we're gonna do this stem cutting. Because I found that that has like I think I lost a leaf there at some point. So I'm actually gonna cut that off and have a nice long stem for me to plant. So now you guys can see I have a bunch of nodes here, I have nodes there, and I have a bunch of little nodes everywhere. So place that right in there. And then you have this like cute propagation jar. And honestly, like I feel like propagation jars are such a vibe. Like they're so pretty. If you can even like decorate them. I've even had propagation jars that I've left out and had them as like decoration and haven't planted them because I mean, if you take care of it, you can have them in the propagation jars for a little bit. So that's it. So now we still have this long trailing pothos, but it's a little bit more manageable and it has more room to now grow. And eventually in time, we'll be able to fill out the pot. So yeah. I did want to show you guys, so a couple weeks ago, I took I think it's a golden pothos cutting off of my hanging planter outside. So you guys can kind of see what it does eventually over time. So Here are some golden pothos cuttings, so you can see like all of these roots that have grown from the nodes. So those are doing well. I probably need to change out the water for it, and these are honestly, in my opinion, ready to plant. Usually you'll want to plant any cuttings when they get to about 1 inch long. I try to get it a little bit longer. I like to do a transition stage where from water propagation, I'll get them like about 1 inch long, and then I'll transition them into moss. It's kind of an easier transition into soil if you're eventually wanting to plant it in soil, just because when they grow roots in water, they typically are a little bit different than a soil root. So sometimes I have a hard time transitioning into soil from water. So the moss is just a good in-between stage, but it's not necessary. You can just plop them right into soil. And yeah. So guys, that's it. So that is kind of my little how to do water propagation. Like I said, I wanted to do this video because I do have now propagation stations in my Etsy store, and I did write a blog on it. So I wanted to kind of have that one-stop shop in case you guys didn't know how to do propagation, but you wanted a little propagation station, or you don't even know how to propagate. Like sometimes people just don't have a great luck with water propagation. And I just wanted to give you guys some tips on like how I am successful with water propagation. These cuttings will sit in there for about a week. And like I said, every week I'm gonna change out the water and just make sure that it just is doing okay and it's not rotting. That's it. I hope you guys all have a great day and stay botanical.